There is a quiet absence in the record, not a dramatic gap marked by fire or collapse, but a stillness that appears where motion is expected. Fossils continue to appear, bones preserved in sediment, teeth locked in ancient jaws, skulls lifted carefully from the earth. And yet, as centuries pass into millennia, the forms do not transform the way they once did. The proportions remain familiar. The posture, the hands, the face, unsettlingly close. Something that should have changed did not. Why? The earliest anatomically modern humans emerged tens of thousands of years ago, already bearing the outline of the present. Long limbs balanced for endurance, hands capable of precision, a skull housing a brain that, in volume at least, rivals or exceeds our own. From that point onward, the variations become subtle, almost shy. A narrowing here, a shortening there. Nothing like the radical reshaping that once separated us from what came before. The record does not announce a conclusion. It simply quiets. Evolution, as it is usually described, does not favor stillness. It responds to pressure, to scarcity, to threat. Teeth sharpen, bones thicken, limbs lengthen or retract. Entire species drift, split, vanish. And yet for humans, after a certain moment, the body seems to hesitate. Ice ages arrive and retreat. Forests spread, then shrink. Predators adapt. Prey adapts. But the human form remains almost stubbornly intact, as though held in place by an invisible hand. This becomes stranger when the world those bodies inhabit is examined more closely. Early humans migrate into extreme environments: frozen tundra, dense jungle, high plateau, open desert. Other animals entering such zones change rapidly or perish. Fur thickens, lungs enlarge, skin shifts tone. Humans instead carry the same basic frame everywhere. Tools and clothing compensate, but the flesh itself appears reluctant to follow. Some researchers point to stabilizing selection, the idea that once a form becomes good enough, deviation becomes dangerous. But this explanation feels incomplete. Nature rarely settles so neatly. Even highly specialized species continue to drift at the margins, accumulating visible changes over time. Humans, by contrast, appear to compress variation inward, preserving an outward template while something else begins to move beneath the surface. The fossil record hints at this tension. Early modern skulls often show larger cranial capacity than those of later agricultural populations. Over time, the average brain volume gently declines, even as symbolic behavior, art, and technology become more complex. Intelligence does not disappear, it relocates. Something once carried by the body begins to migrate elsewhere. Meanwhile, other human forms vanish entirely. Neanderthals persist for hundreds of thousands of years, exquisitely adapted to cold, muscular, resilient. Denisovans leave behind only fragments: teeth, bone, a genetic echo. Homo floresiensis, small-bodied and enigmatic, disappears without explanation. The human tree is pruned aggressively until only one branch remains. The survivor looks finished, as though the work were already done. But survival does not require perfection. It requires flexibility, and flexibility usually leaves marks. Calluses of evolution, reinforcements, exaggerations, compromises. Where are they? Why does the human body exposed to famine, disease, migration, and violence on an unprecedented scale appear to resist visible transformation? One possibility lies not in what changed, but in what was lost. Population bottlenecks compress diversity. Catastrophic climate events erase entire lineages, leaving only a narrow slice of variation to carry forward. Genetic studies suggest moments when humanity may have been reduced to frighteningly small numbers, tens of thousands, perhaps fewer. If so, what survived was not a representative sample, but a contingency, a freeze frame imposed by chance. Yet even this does not fully satisfy the silence, because once numbers rebound, change usually resumes. But here, it does not. Instead, something unprecedented begins to occur. Humans stop adapting primarily through their bodies and begin adapting through their surroundings. Stone replaces claw. Fire replaces fur. Shelter replaces physiology. The environment bends before the body must. This shift is subtle at first, almost invisible, but it compounds. Each generation relies slightly less on inherited physical traits and slightly more on learned behavior. Knowledge becomes transferable without blood. Skills migrate across individuals without waiting for mutation. Selection pressure loosens its grip on the body and tightens elsewhere. The body becomes conservative. Change becomes risky. A stable form allows tools, language, and culture to stack without interruption. The human shape turns into a platform rather than a project. What once evolved to survive the world now survives by rewriting it. And yet, beneath this apparent stability, the cost accumulates quietly. Bones thin, jaws shrink, teeth crowd. Childbirth becomes more dangerous. Modern humans are not stronger than their ancestors. They are, in many ways, more fragile. The stillness of form may not be a triumph, but a compromise. If physical evolution did not stop, but was merely redirected, where did it go? And if the body ceased to change because something else began changing faster, what happens when that balance breaks? The record does not answer. It simply waits, holding its silence, as though the next change has not yet decided where to appear. The silence left behind by the body invites an explanation, and biology offers one that sounds reasonable at first. Stabilizing selection, a phrase that suggests balance, equilibrium, a form refined until further change becomes dangerous. Once a body works well enough, the argument goes, natural selection begins to protect the average and punish deviation. Extremes fade. The middle holds. Evolution continues, but quietly, invisibly, smoothing rather than reshaping. Yet something about this answer remains uneasy. Stabilizing selection is common, but it is rarely absolute. Wolves, sharks, crocodiles, creatures often cited as unchanged, still show measurable shifts when traced carefully across deep time. Teeth adjust. Proportions drift. Size fluctuates with climate. Even living fossils are not frozen. They move slowly, but they move. Humans, by contrast, appear to press pause at precisely the moment their world becomes most unstable. Consider the pressures alone. Rapid climate oscillations, expanding disease ecologies. The introduction of cooked food, then processed grains, dense settlements, prolonged childhoods. No other mammal experiences such a violent rearrangement of its niche without responding physically. And yet, the human skeleton records adaptation almost reluctantly, as though selection were being actively buffered, diluted before it could carve deeply. One explanation begins to emerge when the tempo of human life is examined. Evolution depends on differential survival and reproduction. Traits must fail often enough, catastrophically enough, to be removed. But human culture intervenes early. The injured are fed, the weak are sheltered, the infertile may still survive. Fire, clothing, medicine, and cooperation begin to soften the consequences of biological inadequacy. Selection does not disappear, but it loses its sharpness. This blunting has consequences. Traits that would once have been fatal linger. Bodies that struggle in the wild persist in protected environments. Variation remains, but it is no longer filtered with the same brutality. The human form stabilizes not because it is optimal, but because failure no longer guarantees erasure. Yet this only explains part of the stillness. Even in protected populations, drift should occur. Random mutations should accumulate. Small changes should stack. Instead, what appears is a narrowing, a convergence toward a recognizable template. Modern humans across continents differ far less physically than their ancestors did. Diversity collapses inward. Some researchers point to bottlenecks again. Severe reductions in population size act like sieves, stripping away variation. The survivors repopulate the world, carrying only what passed through the narrowing. Genetic evidence suggests multiple such constrictions. Ice Age cold snaps, volcanic winters, extended droughts. Each one reduces humanity to a fraction of itself. If this is true, then modern humans are not the result of long, gradual refinement, but of repeated resets. Each reset preserves a momentary form and discards alternatives forever. Evolution does not choose the best. It chooses the last. Still, the question lingers. Why did those resets stop producing visible novelty? Why did the survivors of later catastrophes resemble the survivors of earlier ones so closely? The answer may lie not in survival, but in reproduction. As societies grow more complex, mating becomes less random. Cultural boundaries harden. Kinship systems regulate unions. Social status, belief, and language shape who reproduces with whom. Selection shifts from the environment to the group. Physical difference becomes less important than social compatibility. Over time, bodies that fit the social template reproduce more reliably than bodies that do not. Not stronger, not faster, simply acceptable. Evolution follows quietly, trimming the margins. Extremes fade not because they cannot survive, but because they do not belong. This introduces a subtle but profound shift. The human body begins evolving under social pressure rather than environmental pressure. The forest no longer selects. The cold no longer selects. The group does. And the group prefers predictability, familiarity, forms that do not disrupt. In such a system, radical physical change becomes risky. A novel body draws attention. Attention invites scrutiny. Scrutiny invites exclusion. The safest body is the one already known. Evolution, sensing danger, retreats inward. Meanwhile, adaptation finds another route, not through bone, but through behavior. Memory expands, learning accelerates, language deepens. These traits do not fossilize easily. They leave little trace in skeletons. Yet they transform survival more effectively than thicker skin or longer limbs ever could. The body becomes a vessel rather than a weapon, a carrier of cognition rather than a solution in itself. Selection pressure shifts toward the nervous system, toward development, toward plasticity. Even there, change remains subtle. Neural rewiring leaves no bones behind. Over time, the human form becomes conservative by necessity. A stable body allows a volatile mind. A predictable anatomy supports an unpredictable culture. The stillness may not signal an end, but a trade. And yet this trade carries tension. Bodies shaped for scarcity now live in abundance. Bodies tuned for motion now sit still. Bodies adapted for intermittent hunger now face constant availability. The mismatch grows quietly, expressed not through new forms, but through strain, disease, degeneration, fragility. If stabilizing selection truly holds the human form in place, it may be doing so long past the point of safety. What once preserved a successful design may now prevent necessary change. The question becomes unsettling. If the body has been held steady by culture, by protection, by social filtering, what happens when those buffers fail? When the world changes faster than knowledge can compensate? And if evolution has not stopped, but has been waiting, redirected, delayed, where will it surface first when pressure finally returns? The stillness of the human form becomes easier to understand when the moments of extreme narrowing are allowed to surface, not as dramatic legends, but as quiet compressions written into ice cores, pollen records, and scattered bones. There were times when the human story nearly ended, not with a single catastrophe, but with long seasons of attrition. Cold that did not retreat, droughts that stretched beyond memory, ecosystems collapsing faster than bodies could respond. During the late Pleistocene, climate did not shift gently. It lurched. Temperatures swung violently within a few generations. Glaciers advanced and retreated like breathing giants. Forests gave way to grassland, then to dust. In such conditions, evolution usually accelerates. Pressure sharpens. Forms diverge quickly or vanish, and vanish they did. Homo heidelbergensis fades. Neanderthals disappear. Denisovans dissolve into fragments of DNA. Other human experiments end without ceremony, leaving no monuments, only absences. What survives is not the strongest or the smartest, but the smallest viable thread, a lineage that happens to endure long enough to cross the next bottleneck. Genetic evidence whispers of one such narrowing around 70,000 years ago, a period of intense climatic instability possibly linked to massive volcanic activity. The exact cause remains debated, but the effect appears consistent. Human populations may have fallen to a few thousand breeding individuals, a number so small it borders on myth. If true, nearly everyone alive today descends from that thin crossing. In moments like these, evolution behaves differently. Variation is not refined, it is erased. Entire possibilities disappear simply because they were not present in the survivors. The gene pool shrinks. What remains becomes the default. When populations rebound, they do not explore widely. They replicate what worked once. Repeated bottlenecks do this again and again. Each time humanity is reduced, the template hardens. Diversity collapses. The range of possible forms narrows. Evolution does not stop. It becomes constrained, circling a familiar shape rather than branching outward. This helps explain a troubling pattern in the fossil record. Earlier human populations show greater physical diversity than later ones. Faces broader, limbs more varied, body sizes fluctuating dramatically. Over time, the spectrum compresses. Modern humans become more alike than their ancestors ever were. But there is a cost to survival through narrowing. Traits that once offered specialized advantages vanish along with the populations that carried them. Cold-adapted strength, massive bone density, enhanced night vision, alternative metabolic strategies, each lost quietly without record because the lineage that held them did not pass through the gate. What survives is not necessarily optimized but adequate across many contexts. A generalist body, flexible but not extreme, capable of enduring many environments with the aid of behavior rather than anatomy. This generalism becomes humanity's signature and its ceiling. The Ice Age does not merely sculpt landscapes. It edits humanity. It prunes the tree until only one branch remains thick enough to persist. And once the ice recedes, the world opens again, but the diversity does not return. This pattern repeats later in subtler forms. The collapse of megafauna reshapes diets. The younger Dryas snaps a warming world back into cold. Sea levels rise, swallowing coastlines where early populations once thrived. Each disruption erases communities wholesale, not through violence but through displacement, through hunger, through quiet failure to reproduce. Archaeology reveals gaps where dense coastal culture should be. Entire ways of living drowned, leaving inland survivors to repopulate the map. Again, survival passes through narrowing corridors. Again, diversity thins. By the time agriculture emerges, humanity is already filtered, already shaped by survival through repetition. The body that steps into farming is not a blank slate, it is a survivor's body. Conservative, resilient in a general sense, resistant to change because change has been punished too often. This history leaves a subtle imprint on evolution's direction. When diversity is repeatedly lost, selection becomes cautious. Novelty is risky. The environment has proven itself unstable. The safest strategy becomes maintaining a form that can endure multiple resets without specialization. In this sense, the human body does not freeze. It learns to wait, to hold shape while the world rearranges itself violently again and again. Change becomes something to avoid, not pursue. And yet, the mind does not share this caution. While bodies stabilize, cognition expands restlessly. Memory deepens. Planning stretches further into the future. Symbolic thought begins to bind generations together, allowing knowledge to survive resets even when people do not. This is a turning point rarely marked as such. Survival shifts from the body to the continuity of information. Tools and stories outlive catastrophes better than bones do. A spear design can cross a bottleneck more easily than a specialized anatomy. From this moment onward, Physical evolution becomes less urgent. Culture absorbs the shock of change. When the climate shifts, shelters adjust. When prey disappears, diets adapt. The body remains mostly the same, buffered by accumulated knowledge. But buffering has limits. The same conservatism that preserves survival also preserves weakness. Bones thinned by generations without constant strain. Teeth crowded by softer diets. Immune systems tuned to environments that no longer exist. These are not signs of progress or decay. They are artifacts of survival through compression. Evidence that humanity did not evolve smoothly forward, but stumbled repeatedly through narrowing gates, each time emerging less diverse, more uniform, more dependent on something beyond flesh. If the human body appears unchanged, it may be because it is not the site where the real struggle continued. That struggle moved elsewhere, into memory, into language, into the fragile continuity of culture. And if that is true, then the stillness of the body is not an ending, but a pause taken by a species that learned too well how close it once came to disappearing altogether. The question remains suspended in the cold air left behind by those near extinctions. Did humanity stop changing because it reached an optimal form, or because it became afraid to change at all? What follows the long season of ice is not a sudden flowering, but a tightening. The world warms unevenly. Glaciers loosen their grip. Rivers swell and wander. Grasslands spread where tundra once ruled. For a brief moment, mobility remains possible, even necessary. Humans continue to move, to follow herds, to respond to the land with their whole bodies. But something subtle begins to shift, not outwardly, not at once. Settling does not arrive as a decision. It arrives as a convenience, repeated too many times. A good valley, a reliable water source, a stand of grain that returns year after year. At first, camps linger a little longer, then tools grow heavier, storage appears. The rhythm of movement slows, then fragments. Bodies that once traveled vast distances begin to trace smaller circles. The skeletal record notices this almost immediately. Bones tell quiet truths. Leg strength diminishes. Upper limbs lose the asymmetry of constant throwing. Spines compress differently. The body, once shaped by endurance and variation, begins to reflect repetition. The same motions, the same postures, over and over. Agriculture does not merely change diet, it changes time. Days become structured, seasons become obligations. The body adapts not by growing stronger, but by becoming compliant. Pain is endured rather than escaped. Hunger becomes predictable rather than fatal. Survival no longer depends on reacting quickly to danger, but on tolerating monotony. This marks a deep inversion of evolutionary pressure. In a foraging world, the body must perform. In a farming world, the body must persist. Endurance shifts from movement to patience, from responsiveness to routine. The traits that thrive are no longer those that excel in extremes, but those that endure repetition without breaking. And so, change slows further, not because there is no pressure, but because the pressure is uniform. Uniform pressure favors uniform bodies. Variation becomes inefficient. The field does not reward difference. The plow does not care how gracefully a body moves, only that it shows up again tomorrow. Skulls from early agricultural societies tell a quiet story of strain. Teeth crowd as jaws shorten. Malnutrition leaves its signature in enamel defects. Stature decreases. Bone density drops. These are not improvements. They are accommodations. The body does not evolve upward. It compromises. Yet alongside this physical contraction, something else expands. Population, memory, obligation. The human mind becomes entangled with place in a way it never was before. Identity attaches to land. Lineage attaches to soil. The body becomes less important than continuity. This is not immediately obvious as a turning point. For thousands of years, humans still look broadly familiar. But the direction of change has been set. Evolution no longer rewards adaptability of form. It rewards tolerance of structure, the ability to remain functional within narrow parameters. Over time, this has a chilling effect on physical novelty. Bodies that struggle under repetitive strain survive if supported by community. Bodies that fail are replaced not by better adapted ones, but by more numerous ones. Selection shifts from quality to quantity, and with quantity comes standardization. Cultural norms solidify. Expectations form around what a body should be able to do, how it should behave, how long it should endure. Difference becomes disruptive. Uniformity becomes efficient. This is not enforced violently at first. It is enforced subtly, through labor roles, through inheritance, through marriage, through the quiet pressure to fit. Bodies that deviate too far from the norm find fewer paths forward, fewer opportunities to reproduce. Not because they cannot survive, but because they do not align. Thus, the human form is sculpted not by predators or climate, but by calendars and walls, by storage pits and property lines. The body becomes an instrument of continuity rather than exploration. This also changes how children grow. Extended childhoods lengthen further. Learning becomes more important than strength. Knowledge must be transmitted accurately, not rediscovered anew each generation. Bodies that mature slowly are not a liability in a settled world. They are an investment. The nervous system responds. Plasticity becomes central. The ability to absorb instruction, to conform, to internalize norms becomes more valuable than raw physical prowess. Selection tilts again, away from muscle and toward malleability. And yet the skeleton remains stubbornly similar. The same bipedal frame, the same hands, the same skull. The outward human shape becomes increasingly conservative, while the inner experience of being human grows more complex, more constrained, more abstract. Agriculture introduces another quiet force: surplus. With surplus comes hierarchy. With hierarchy comes power. And power has preferences. Those who control resources shape norms. Bodies associated with authority become models. Others adapt or disappear. Over generations, this social filtering further suppresses divergence. Bodies that resemble those in power gain subtle advantages. Those that do not are quietly sidelined. Evolution listens, as it always does, but the signal is no longer natural. It is social. By the time cities rise, the human body has already ceded its role as the primary site of adaptation. Change continues, but it is slow, conservative, incremental. The dramatic leaps belong to tools, to architecture, to systems of thought. The body remains behind, anchoring a civilization that accelerates away from it. And so the question deepens. If the human body ceased to change because settlement rewarded sameness, then what happens when the world demands difference again? When stability fractures? When repetition no longer sustains? Has the body forgotten how to evolve quickly? Or has it simply been waiting, conserved by a way of life that cannot last forever? The fields remain quiet. The bones remain familiar. But the tension between a fixed form and an unstable world continues to tighten, unnoticed beneath the surface of history. There is a subtle reversal hidden in the measurements of ancient skulls. It does not announce itself loudly, and for a long time it was dismissed as noise, variation, sampling error, the kind of statistical drift that appears when data is sparse. But as more remains were recovered, a pattern emerged that refused to settle. After reaching a peak in the late Upper Paleolithic, the average human brain began to shrink. Not dramatically, not enough to alarm, just enough to be noticed by those who kept measuring. Early modern humans, tens of thousands of years ago, carried brains slightly larger than those of people living today. This is not speculation. It is bone and volume, calipers and casts, a difference of roughly 10% unfolding slowly across millennia. At the same time, everything associated with intelligence appears to intensify. Art becomes more symbolic, language more layered, technology more cumulative, social structures more intricate. If intelligence were a simple matter of volume, this should not happen. The contradiction lingers like a quiet ache. One response is efficiency. Brains, like any organ, are costly. They consume enormous energy. In a world where survival depends less on raw sensory processing and more on learned behavior, redundancy becomes waste. Neural circuits can be streamlined, excess mass trimmed. The mind does not weaken, it refines. Yet this explanation only circles the surface. Other species show increases in brain size when social complexity rises. Humans alone appear to compress. It is as though something once housed in flesh has found a different place to reside. The skull itself changes shape. Faces flatten. Brow ridges soften. Teeth reduce. The head becomes more graceful, less armored. Early human skulls often look heavy, reinforced, built to absorb impact. Later skulls look delicate by comparison. Protection gives way to exposure. This is not merely aesthetic. A thinner skull suggests a quieter life, fewer blows, less constant physical threat. A world where danger is mediated by walls, by rules, by distance. The body relaxes. The armor is no longer required. But the brain shrinking within that skull remains unsettling. Evolution rarely reduces such a crucial organ without cause, especially not across an entire species. One possibility lies in delegation. Tasks once handled internally are gradually offloaded. Memory moves into objects, knots in rope, marks on bone, patterns in stone. Eventually, symbols on clay and papyrus. The brain no longer needs to retain everything. It needs only to know where knowledge resides. This is not loss. It is redistribution. Intelligence becomes externalized, scaffolded by the environment. The human mind stretches outward, embedding itself in tools and systems that persist beyond individual lifespans. As this happens, selection pressure on individual cognitive capacity changes. Survival no longer depends solely on one brain's ability to recall, calculate, or imagine. It depends on participation in a shared network of information. A slightly smaller brain that integrates well may outperform a larger one that stands alone. Over generations, this logic hardens. Children are born into worlds dense with instruction. They learn before they explore. They inherit solutions rather than invent them. Brains adapt not for raw expansion, but for compatibility. The nervous system becomes tuned for learning rather than discovery, for absorption rather than generation. This does not diminish intelligence, but it reshapes it. Creativity shifts from solitary insight to collective recombination. The body follows reluctantly. Head size at birth narrows slightly, easing childbirth in populations where maternal survival matters more than maximizing cranial volume. Infants are born more helpless, their brains unfinished, requiring prolonged care. This allows development to be guided by culture rather than genetics. In this way, brain shrinkage is not a retreat, but a concession, a trade that favors flexibility over capacity, plasticity over power. The brain becomes less a fixed organ and more a process unfolding in context. Still, there is a cost. Externalized intelligence is fragile. It depends on continuity, on stable transmission, on archives that survive disaster. When knowledge is lost, it does not regrow biologically. It must be rediscovered, painfully, by minds no longer built to reconstruct everything from scratch. Archaeology records moments when this happened. Technologies vanish. Skills disappear for thousands of years. Stoneworking techniques forgotten. Seafaring lost. Complex systems collapse into simplicity. Each time, humanity does not physically adapt downward. It merely forgets. The brain does not re-expand to compensate. The body does not harden again. Instead, populations struggle with the same fragile form, lacking the scaffolding it quietly depended on. This suggests that the human brain, once reduced, cannot easily reclaim its former architecture. Evolution does not reverse cleanly. Paths once abandoned are not easily retraced. If so, then the shrinkage of the brain marks a point of no return. A commitment to external intelligence so complete that the body itself becomes incapable of reclaiming what it surrendered. This raises an uncomfortable thought. Perhaps the human body stopped changing because it crossed a threshold, a point where further biological investment became inefficient compared to cultural investment. From that moment on, evolution favored stability, not innovation, in the flesh. The skull becomes a container rather than a frontier, the brain a node rather than a universe. Intelligence migrates into networks, leaving the body behind as infrastructure. If this is true, then the stillness of the human form is not an accident. It is a consequence of having moved the center of adaptation elsewhere. And yet the question remains unresolved. What happens when the external systems that carry intelligence begin to outpace the brain's ability to integrate them? When knowledge grows faster than comprehension, when memory exceeds meaning. If the human brain has already given up its excess, trusting the world to hold what it cannot, what happens when the world becomes too complex to hold it all? The skull stays quiet, the measurements remain steady, but the tension between a shrinking organ and an expanding reality continues to build unseen within the silence of bone. Long before the body began to hesitate, the hand learned to remember for it. This memory did not reside in muscle or nerve alone, but in the shape of stone, the balance of wood, the edge that fit the palm in a particular way. Tools became extensions not just of action, but of cognition. A spear point carried the memory of how to hunt. A blade held the knowledge of how to cut. The body no longer needed to reinvent its movements each time. It only needed to hold what already knew. At first, this external memory remained intimate. The tool was carried, repaired, modified by the same hands that used it. Knowledge still lived close to flesh, but gradually the distance grew. Techniques were passed from one person to another, then from one generation to the next, eventually from one culture to another. Memory detached itself from individual bodies and began to circulate. This changes how evolution listens. When survival depends on skill that can be learned, selection pressure on the body softens. A hand does not need to be stronger if leverage improves. Eyes do not need to sharpen if distance can be measured. Reflexes need not quicken if traps can wait patiently. The body is relieved of its burden, and in that relief it begins to conserve. Archaeological layers record this shift subtly. Stone tools become more standardized. Techniques persist for thousands of years with little modification. A successful design freezes in place, copied faithfully rather than reinvented. This is efficiency, but also inertia. Once a solution exists outside the body, there is less incentive for the body to change. The nervous system adapts accordingly. Instead of encoding every survival pattern biologically, it becomes adept at imitation, at following sequences, at absorbing instruction. Mirror neurons strengthen. Learning accelerates. Plasticity becomes the trait under quiet selection. This has profound implications. A plastic brain thrives in a stable body. The more predictable the anatomy, the easier it is to transmit skills reliably. Tools fit standardized hands. Postures repeat. Movements become codified. The body becomes a template that culture can depend on. Deviation once again becomes costly. A hand too small, a grip too weak, a body shaped differently struggles to use inherited tools. Not because it cannot adapt, but because adaptation requires redesigning the entire external system. It is easier to shape bodies to fit tools than tools to fit bodies. Thus, technology begins to shape anatomy indirectly, not by selecting for strength or speed, but by selecting against deviation. The human form stabilizes further, locked into compatibility with its own inventions. Over time, this compatibility becomes invisible. Tools feel natural. Interfaces feel intuitive. The body forgets that it was ever different. Evolution slows not because pressure vanishes, but because it is channeled into narrow corridors. Memory continues to migrate outward, from tools to symbols, from symbols to systems. Counting stones become numbers, marks become writing. Writing becomes archives. Knowledge accumulates far beyond what any single brain could hold. At this stage, the body is no longer the primary archive of survival. It is an access point, a reader, a user. Evolution recognizes this shift and responds conservatively. Why invest in biological memory when memory can be stored elsewhere? This logic deepens with each generation. Children grow surrounded by solutions they did not earn. They learn how to use fire without understanding combustion, how to shape stone without rediscovering fracture mechanics, how to navigate landscapes with maps drawn by others. The body adapts not by changing form, but by shortening the path from ignorance to competence. Selection favors those who learn quickly, not those who innovate physically, those who conform, not those who deviate. The human body becomes increasingly standardized, not by decree, but by use. There is a quiet cost to this outsourcing. When memory leaves the body, it becomes vulnerable. Tools break, archives burn, skills vanish if not practiced. The body, having relinquished its redundancies, cannot always compensate. This is visible in moments of collapse. When systems fail, humans struggle not because they lack intelligence, but because their bodies are no longer prepared to improvise without scaffolding. Strength is insufficient. Endurance is mismatched. Senses dulled by mediation. Yet evolution does not immediately respond. The time scales are misaligned. Cultural change accelerates. Biological change lags. The body remains shaped for a world that no longer exists, relying on tools that may not always be there. This mismatch grows quietly. Each innovation deepens dependence. Each layer of external memory reduces the need for internal adaptation. The body becomes increasingly conservative, even as the environment becomes more artificial, more volatile. From an evolutionary perspective, this is unprecedented. A species that adapts primarily through things rather than flesh, that evolves by building rather than becoming. The body, once the primary site of negotiation with reality, steps aside. The stillness observed in the human form begins to make sense here. It is not a failure of evolution, but a redirection. Change continues, but it accumulates in artifacts, not anatomy, in networks, not nerves, in systems that outlive bodies, rather than in bodies that outlast systems. But this strategy assumes continuity. It assumes that tools will persist, that knowledge will be transmitted, that environments will remain legible. When those assumptions fail, the consequences are severe. History hints at this fragility. Periods where technology regresses, where complexity collapses, where knowledge must be rebuilt from fragments. Each time, humanity does not grow stronger bodies in response. It waits. It remembers imperfectly. It rebuilds slowly. The body remains a constant, even as everything around it resets. If external memory has replaced physical adaptation, then the apparent halt in human evolution may be conditional, not permanent, but contingent on the continued success of the systems that carry what the body no longer does. The question then becomes unavoidable. If the scaffolding collapses, if tools fail to carry memory forward, will the body remember how to change again? Or has it, through long reliance, forgotten how to listen to pressure at all? The hand still fits the tool still fits the hand, but beneath this harmony lies a dependency so deep that its consequences have yet to fully reveal themselves. When marks began to hold meaning independent of the hand that made them, something irreversible occurred. A sound could be fixed. A thought could outlive the thinker. Memory, once tethered to breath and gesture, slipped free of the body entirely and settled onto surfaces that did not age as flesh does. Clay tablets hardened, ink dried, stone endured. The human body, for the first time, was no longer the primary vessel of its own continuity. Writing did not arrive as a revelation. It crept in through accounting, through ritual, through the need to remember what the body could not reliably hold across generations. Grain stores needed tallying, lineages needed recording, promises needed proof. Each mark was small, functional, unambitious. And yet, together, they shifted the axis of adaptation. Once knowledge could persist outside the body, evolution received a new signal. Survival no longer depended on remembering accurately, only on accessing correctly. The brain's task changed. It no longer needed to carry entire worlds within it. It needed to navigate systems that did. This altered selection in a way that fossils cannot easily show. Bodies that could read, recite, obey, and replicate symbols thrived. Bodies that could not were quietly marginalized. Intelligence became less about raw perception and more about alignment with encoded meaning. Written language rewards precision over intuition. It values consistency, not improvisation. Symbols must be repeated exactly to function. A slight deviation alters meaning. Over time, this trains minds toward standardization, toward compliance with established forms. The body follows where the mind leads. Movement becomes constrained by scripts, gestures ritualized, postures formalized. The flesh becomes disciplined, trained to serve abstractions rather than respond to immediate sensation. This discipline seeps inward. Children learn to sit still, to suppress impulse, to move on command. Bodies that resist these demands are corrected, not violently but persistently. Over generations, this reshapes what is rewarded. Evolution does not hear words, but it hears outcomes. Those who adapt to symbolic systems reproduce more reliably. Those who do not fall behind. The body, once again, is filtered not by nature, but by institution. Writing also introduces permanence. A law once written can outlast its context. A belief once recorded can survive contradiction. This creates a new kind of pressure, the pressure of continuity. Bodies must adapt to systems that do not adapt to them. Institutions emerge to protect these systems. Schools, temples, bureaucracies. Each one preserves a version of the human that fits its codes. Deviation becomes error. Error becomes heresy. Heresy becomes exclusion. This does not require conspiracy. It requires only repetition. Each generation inherits not just knowledge, but constraints. The body is trained to fit the archive, not the other way around. In such a world, radical physical change becomes maladaptive. A body that cannot sit, cannot write, cannot perform ritualized labor becomes incompatible. The safest evolutionary path is sameness. Predictability, a form that institutions can rely on. Thus, writing quietly arrests anatomy. Not by decree, but by preference. The human form becomes canonical. Deviations are corrected socially long before they can propagate biologically. There is a deeper consequence. Once knowledge is externalized, the body's relationship to time changes. The past becomes accessible without memory. The future becomes planned without instinct. The present loses urgency. Evolution thrives on immediacy, on failure that kills quickly, on success that reproduces immediately. Writing stretches time, smoothing consequences across generations. Mistakes can be corrected intellectually rather than biologically. Errors can be recorded and avoided without changing bodies. This slows evolution further. The body is no longer the site where lessons are learned. It becomes the site where lessons are applied. Over centuries, this produces a curious inversion. Bodies grow more fragile, not less. They rely on recorded knowledge to survive environments they are no longer physically suited for. Yet they persist, because the archive persists. When archives collapse, the fragility is exposed. Historical dark ages are not merely losses of knowledge. They are moments when bodies suddenly find themselves unsupported. Skills once learned through text must be rediscovered through pain. Still, the body does not harden in response. It waits for the archive to return. This suggests a dependency so deep that evolution itself has been lulled into stillness. Selection pressure is delayed, deflected, absorbed by systems designed to preserve continuity at all costs. The human body becomes a constant in a world of variables, reliable, predictable, manageable, a stable platform for ideas that change far faster than flesh ever could. But this stability has a shadow. When symbols dominate reality, the body's signals are often ignored. Hunger is scheduled, sleep is regulated, pain is postponed. The body adapts by becoming quieter, less insistent. Physiological cues dull. Stress accumulates. Diseases of regulation appear. These are not new pressures, but old ones deferred. If writing and the systems it birthed have held the human form in place, then the question is not whether evolution stopped, but whether it was interrupted, paused by a technology that promised continuity without transformation. And if that pause has lasted thousands of years, what happens when symbolic systems begin to fracture under their own weight? When information overwhelms comprehension? When archives grow faster than bodies can adapt to them? The marks remain, the records endure, the human form stays familiar. But beneath the stillness, something waits, uncertain whether the next change will belong to flesh again or whether the body has already surrendered that role forever. Once continuity becomes sacred, deviation turns dangerous. This is not announced openly. It unfolds quietly through preservation, through the careful repetition of forms deemed correct, acceptable, orthodox. Over time, entire systems arise whose purpose is not to explore what humans could become, but to protect what humans already are. Priesthoods, councils, academies, lineages of authority, each claims stewardship over truth, over knowledge, over the shape of meaning itself. They do not need to conspire. Their function alone is enough. To preserve doctrine is to preserve form. To maintain order is to stabilize expectation. Bodies that fit easily within these expectations pass unnoticed. Bodies that do not are corrected, isolated, or erased from record. This does not require cruelty. Often it wears the mask of care, instruction, discipline, salvation. The body is taught how to kneel, how to bow, how to stand in line, how to repeat words that do not originate within it. Over generations, this training becomes instinctual. Children learn not just what to believe, but how to hold themselves while believing it. The human body becomes ritualized, movement constrained into symbolic gestures, time segmented by bells and calendars. Even pain is given meaning, framed as necessary, purifying, instructive. The flesh is no longer a site of negotiation with nature, but a vessel for continuity. In such systems, novelty is not merely inconvenient, it is destabilizing. A body that moves differently disrupts ritual. A mind that perceives differently disrupts doctrine. The safest bodies are those that disappear into the pattern. Evolution hears this clearly. Reproductive success follows alignment. Families that fit the social mold thrive, those that do not fragment. Over time, the human form is filtered not by survival in the wild, but by survival within institutions. This filtering leaves little trace in bone. It leaves no dramatic mutation, no obvious adaptation. Instead, it smooths edges. It narrows variance. It encourages a body that can endure long hours of stillness, repetitive labor, regulated movement, a body that does not demand too much. The irony is that these institutions often arise in response to chaos. They promise stability after collapse, order after flood, meaning after loss. But in preserving one version of humanity, they quietly prevent others from emerging. Ancient texts hint at this tension. Stories of giants before the flood, of long-lived ancestors whose bodies differed from those who came later. These accounts are often dismissed as metaphor. Yet they may encode a memory of physical diversity now lost, flattened by resets and preserved only as myth. As writing hardens belief, belief hardens the body, not through genetics alone, but through relentless conditioning. The body learns where it belongs, what it is allowed to be. Medical texts from early civilizations reveal another shift. Deformity becomes categorized, normality defined. Bodies are measured against ideals rather than environments. What cannot be corrected is hidden. What cannot be hidden is explained away. This is a profound change. Once, variation was simply variation. Now it is error, deviation, something to be managed. The result is a narrowing of acceptable forms, not because others cannot exist, but because they are not permitted to persist socially. Evolution, once again, follows the path of least resistance. Over centuries, this produces a curious illusion. Humanity appears unchanged. The same bodies repeat across generations, across regions, across empires. The fossil record reflects this sameness, but not its cause. Behind it stands a dense web of continuity enforcing systems, each one preserving the human form as a stable constant within an unstable world, each one quietly discouraging the physical divergence that once marked evolution's progress. This raises an uncomfortable possibility that human evolution did not simply slow because of technology or comfort, but because power prefers predictability. Bodies that change threaten systems built on repetition. Institutions select against them long before nature can. Even collapse does not fully release this grip. When empires fall, their norms linger. Their texts are copied, their rituals adapted. The body remains bound to inherited expectations even as circumstances change. And so, the human form carries layers of historical inertia. Each generation inherits not only genes, but constraints shaped by vanished powers. The body becomes an archive of obedience as much as survival. If this is true, then the stillness of human anatomy is not merely biological. It is political, cultural, structural, a consequence of living too long inside systems designed to preserve themselves. The question then shifts again. If institutions once arrested physical change to maintain order, what happens when those institutions lose legitimacy, when belief fragments, when authority dissolves, when continuity fractures faster than it can be repaired? Will the body, long held in place by ritual and rule, begin to drift again? Or has it been stabilized for so long that even freedom cannot restart its motion? History does not answer. It only shows cycles of control and collapse, each one leaving the human form much as it was before. Perhaps the body learned somewhere deep in its long memory that changing too much invites erasure. That survival lies not in becoming different, but in becoming acceptable. And if that lesson is embedded now not in genes but in expectation, then evolution may not return simply because the pressure does. The flesh remains quiet, the posture familiar, the bones unremarkable. But beneath the calm surface of continuity, something waits. Uncertain whether the age of preserved humanity was a shelter or a long confinement whose door has not yet been tested. Even preservation fractures eventually. No structure holds forever. No archive remains intact across every age. And yet, when continuity breaks, it does so unevenly. Some things vanish abruptly. Others endure, oddly unchanged, carried across the rupture like objects sealed in sediment. The human body appears to belong to this second category. Civilizations collapse, knowledge scatters, landscapes empty, but the form persists, remarkably familiar on the other side. History records these resets imperfectly. Flood myths echo across cultures. Fires consume cities. Trade routes dissolve. Writing thins, then disappears altogether in some regions for centuries. The record grows quiet again. And yet, when it resumes, the human skeleton does not announce a new beginning. There is no sudden anatomical reinvention. The same proportions return as though nothing had happened. This is puzzling. Collapse should reintroduce pressure. Loss of infrastructure should demand physical resilience. Scarcity should reward strength, endurance, adaptability. But the body does not respond in kind. It does not harden. It does not diversify. It waits. The so-called dark ages are dark not because nothing happens, but because less is recorded. Life continues in fragments. Skills survive in pockets. Knowledge migrates orally. Communities contract and reform. But the body remains largely the same, caught between past systems and future ones. One explanation lies in the nature of collapse itself. Most collapses are not total. They are partial, uneven, staggered. Some regions fall while others persist. Refugees carry habits, tools, and expectations into new environments. Even when writing vanishes, memory does not reset completely. Enough structure remains to buffer the body from raw selection. But there is another possibility, more unsettling, that the human form had already become decoupled from immediate adaptation long before these collapses occurred. That by the time systems failed, the body no longer knew how to respond quickly enough to benefit. If adaptation had migrated into culture, then collapse does not trigger biological change. It triggers cultural loss. The body suffers but does not evolve. The timescales no longer align. Archaeology hints at this misalignment. Periods of regression show simpler tools, reduced trade, fewer settlements, but they do not show new anatomies emerging to cope with these conditions. Instead, mortality rises, populations shrink, then stabilize again once minimal systems return. Evolution selects through death, but only if variation exists to select from. By this point, variation is thin. Bottlenecks have already done their work. Institutions have already standardized bodies. There is little left to reshape. This produces a strange pattern. Humanity endures catastrophe not by becoming different, but by becoming fewer. Survival through reduction, not transformation. Over time, this pattern repeats enough to leave an imprint. The body learns, in a sense, that collapse is temporary, that suffering does not last long enough to justify biological reinvention. Better to wait, better to persist. The younger Dryas offers a telling example. A sudden return to near glacial conditions after warming had begun. A shock to early agricultural experiments. Settlements abandoned, populations displaced. Yet when warmth returns, the same body resumes farming. The interruption leaves cultural scars, not anatomical ones. Sea level rise tells a similar story. Vast coastal populations likely drowned or fled as ice melted, shorelines erased, knowledge lost. But the survivors inland carry the same form forward. No aquatic adaptation appears, no visible response to the loss of marine niches. This suggests a deep confidence in continuity, not conscious but embedded, a species that expects recovery, even if it does not understand how. But confidence can become vulnerability. Each reset strips away layers of redundancy. Each collapse erases possibilities that never return. The human form remains, but it becomes increasingly dependent on systems that must be rebuilt again and again. At some point, the balance shifts. Cultural recovery becomes slower. Complexity takes longer to re-emerge. Knowledge fragments more severely. Bodies persist, but the scaffolding they rely on grows more fragile. This is visible in the long arcs between collapses and recoveries. Early resets are followed by rapid innovation. Later ones take centuries to heal. The body stays the same, but the world it must navigate grows more complex, more demanding. If physical evolution has been waiting for pressure strong enough and long enough to matter, collapse has not yet provided it. The shocks are sharp but brief, deadly but not transformative. The question lingers in this pattern. What kind of disruption would be required to force the body to change again? Not a temporary collapse, but a sustained environment where old systems cannot return. A world where waiting is no longer viable. History offers no clear example of this. Every fall is followed eventually by rebuilding. The human form, conserved through centuries of expectation, survives to inherit the reconstruction. Perhaps this is why myths linger of earlier ages where bodies were different. Taller, stronger, longer lived. Not because they were true in detail, but because they express a sense that something was lost before memory began. A time when humanity still changed visibly, before it learned to endure instead. If so, then the stillness of the human body is not a sign of completion, but of postponement. Change deferred, not denied. And postponement carries risk, because the longer evolution waits, the more abrupt its return may need to be. The record remains quiet. The bones do not speak of transformation. But history itself seems to circle a growing uncertainty, a sense that the strategy of waiting may not always succeed. If the next disruption is not followed by recovery, if continuity truly breaks rather than bends, the human body may be forced to remember how to change again, or it may discover too late that it no longer knows how. The silence continues, heavy with that unresolved possibility. When the body no longer adapts outwardly, its tension turns inward. The absence of visible evolution does not mean the absence of strain. It means the strain has found quieter paths to express itself. Modern illness, in this light, begins to resemble something other than malfunction. It looks like adaptation stalled mid-process, caught between a body shaped for one world and a reality that no longer resembles it. Consider how many of today's most persistent conditions do not arise from sudden trauma, but from mismatch. Metabolic disorders in bodies tuned for scarcity. Anxiety in nervous systems shaped to detect predators, now flooded with abstraction. Degenerative diseases in skeletons designed for motion, now held still for years at a time. These are not random failures. They follow patterns too consistent to ignore. Evolution typically resolves mismatch by change, but when change is delayed, the cost accumulates as pathology. The body compensates where it can, sacrifices where it must. Organs overwork, systems inflame, balance becomes fragile. This fragility is often framed as decline, as weakness compared to ancestral robustness. But decline implies direction. What appears instead is suspension. The body is neither adapting nor reverting. It is enduring. Medical records across cultures reveal how recent this is. Many chronic conditions explode in prevalence only after environments change faster than bodies can track. Urbanization, industrial food, artificial light, constant stimulation. Each one introduces pressures that would once have demanded physical response. Instead, the response is internal dysregulation. This is not how evolution typically operates. Selection removes traits that fail catastrophically. Chronic illness does not remove, it lingers. It allows survival with suffering. Reproduction continues. The signal becomes blurred. Medicine further softens selection. Treatments do not eliminate traits, they manage them. The body is preserved in its compromised state, stabilized rather than transformed. This is compassion, but it also delays adaptation. Over generations, the accumulation grows. Traits once neutral become liabilities. Bodies struggle not because they are failing, but because they are outdated, designed for conditions that no longer apply. Yet evolution remains quiet. The expected anatomical responses do not appear. No new digestive system emerges, no redesigned spine, no radically altered sensory apparatus. The human form remains, absorbing the stress. One explanation lies in time. Evolution requires consistency. Pressure must persist across many generations without relief. Modern pressures fluctuate too quickly. Diets change within decades. Environments transform within lifetimes. The body does not know which signal to trust. Another lies in buffering. Technology continuously intervenes. Climate control, pharmaceuticals, prosthetics. Each one reduces the urgency of biological response. The body is patched, supported, extended. Selection is postponed. But there is a deeper tension. Many modern pathologies emerge precisely because bodies are no longer allowed to fail outright. In the past, a severe mismatch would end a lineage. Now it produces a diagnosis. This changes evolution's language. Instead of removal, there is accommodation. Instead of divergence, there is management. The body is preserved in its incomplete state. In this sense, disease becomes a record of unrealized adaptation. Each condition a note in the margin of evolution's unfinished work. A reminder of pressures acknowledged but unresolved. Some researchers suggest that epigenetics offers a partial response. Chemical markers adjust gene expression without altering DNA itself. Stress, diet, and environment can leave signatures passed down for a few generations. This is adaptation without form. But epigenetic changes fade. They do not rewrite the body permanently. They offer flexibility, not transformation, a stopgap rather than a solution. Thus, the human body exists in a prolonged holding pattern, too protected to evolve quickly, too stressed to remain truly stable, suspended between worlds. This suspension has psychological echoes, a pervasive sense of unease, a feeling of being out of place. Not because the world is hostile, but because it is unfamiliar to bodies shaped for something else. The body whispers its discomfort through pain, fatigue, anxiety. These signals are often muted, medicated, normalized. The message remains unheard. If evolution once spoke through visible change, it now speaks through symptoms. The question is whether these symptoms are being listened to as signals or merely silenced as noise. History suggests that long periods of suppressed adaptation eventually resolve one way or another. Either pressure dissipates or change breaks through suddenly. Gradualism gives way to punctuation. The human body has delayed for a remarkably long time. It has endured mismatch with patience unprecedented in evolutionary history, but patience is not infinite. The accumulation of pathology may be the early tremor of a deeper shift, not yet visible in bone or form, but present in function, in resilience, in tolerance. If the body has been waiting for a pressure it cannot escape, modernity may be assembling one unintentionally. A convergence of stresses that cannot be buffered indefinitely. And when buffering fails, evolution will speak again, not politely, not slowly, but decisively. The silence that once suggested stillness may, in retrospect, reveal itself as tension held too long. Whether that tension resolves through renewed biological change or through widespread breakdown remains uncertain. The body continues on, familiar in shape, uneasy in function, carrying within it the unresolved question of how long a species can postpone becoming something new. Beneath the apparent stillness of the human form, something continues to move quietly, almost furtively. Not in bone or muscle, not in the visible architecture that fossils preserve, but in switches so small they escape casual notice. Chemical marks, methyl groups, patterns of activation and silence written not into genes themselves, but onto the way genes are read. This is where some have begun to look when physical evolution appears to pause. Epigenetics does not rewrite the body's blueprint. It annotates it. It decides which instructions are emphasized and which are ignored, depending on context. Stress can tighten expression. Abundance can loosen it. Trauma can echo for generations without ever changing a single letter of DNA. This offers an unsettling compromise. Adaptation without transformation, change that leaves no fossil trace. Studies of famine survivors reveal this clearly. Descendants carry altered metabolic responses decades later, bodies primed for scarcity they never personally experienced. Children of stress inherit heightened sensitivity, nervous systems tuned for vigilance. These are not mutations, they are memories. In earlier epochs, such pressures might have driven visible anatomical change, but now, buffered by culture and medicine, the body adapts quietly, temporarily. The change fades if conditions improve. evolution experiments, then erases its own notes. This makes the human body appear static even as it responds constantly. The surface remains familiar. The interior adjusts and readjusts, generation after generation, without committing to form. From one perspective, this is remarkable flexibility, a way to respond rapidly without the risks of permanent change. From another, it is hesitation, a refusal to choose a direction. Epigenetic adaptation depends on continuity of pressure. When conditions fluctuate too quickly, the signals conflict. One generation primes for hunger, the next grows in abundance. The body oscillates, never settling long enough to evolve structurally. Modern life amplifies this instability. Diets change within years. Stressors appear and vanish. Environments shift faster than reproduction cycles. The body receives instructions, then contradictory instructions, then none at all. In this noise, epigenetics becomes a whisper rather than a guide. Adaptation occurs, but it does not accumulate. It resets. This creates an illusion of stasis. Evolution is active, but indecisive. The body is responsive, but non-committal. There is also a deeper implication. Epigenetic inheritance weakens the link between biology and destiny. Traits are no longer solely passed through structure, but through context. What you experience shapes what your children inherit. Briefly, this collapses time. The past presses more directly on the present, but it also prevents long-term divergence. If adaptations can be undone within a few generations, then populations do not drift apart as easily. Humanity remains physically cohesive. Once again, sameness is preserved. Some have suggested that this mechanism itself was selected for, that after repeated bottlenecks and collapses, a species that could adapt quickly without locking itself into form gained an advantage. Plasticity over permanence. If so, then the human body did not stop evolving. It evolved a way to avoid evolving too visibly. But plasticity has limits. It works best within known ranges. Extreme conditions still demand structural response. Epigenetics can tune metabolism, but it cannot grow gills. It can sensitize nerves, but it cannot add limbs. The question becomes whether humanity has remained within a narrow enough band of conditions for this strategy to hold. So far, it has. Barely. As environments grow more artificial, more abstract, the signals become harder to interpret biologically. Stress without predator. Scarcity without famine. Overstimulation without threat. The body responds as best it can, but the mismatch grows. Epigenetic marks accumulate without resolution. Nervous systems stay primed. Metabolism stays confused. The body becomes a palimpsest of incomplete instructions. At some point, this may force a reckoning. Either pressures stabilize long enough for structural change to occur, or plasticity collapses under contradiction. There is a quiet irony here. The very mechanism that allowed humanity to avoid drastic physical change may now be preventing it from responding adequately to unprecedented conditions. If epigenetics is evolution's shorthand, then humanity has been living in draft mode for millennia. Always adjusting, never finalizing. This draft status keeps the body familiar, recognizable across time. It also leaves it perpetually provisional. The fossil record shows little. The skeleton does not betray this inner turbulence. But biology suggests a species constantly tuning itself, never settling. Perhaps this is why the question of halted evolution feels so persistent. We are looking for change in the wrong place, expecting it to announce itself in bone when it now hides in regulation. Yet regulation cannot carry us indefinitely. At some scale, flesh must follow function. If the human body has deferred visible evolution through epigenetic flexibility, then the pause is not a stop, but a suspension, a holding of breath. And breath cannot be held forever. Whether the release comes as gradual transformation or sudden rupture remains unknown. But the quiet activity beneath the surface suggests that the stillness is not peace, it is restraint. And restraint, like silence, is often mistaken for absence, until it breaks. There is another pressure that rarely leaves marks on bone, yet shapes bodies relentlessly over time. It does not come from climate or scarcity, nor from collapse or catastrophe. It comes from watching, from being seen, from existing within the gaze of others long enough for that gaze to become a force of selection. As human groups grew denser and more interconnected, survival depended less on physical dominance and more on acceptance. To be chosen, to be trusted, to be included. These are not abstract needs. They determine access to resources, protection, mates. Over generations, they shape who reproduces and who does not. This introduces a subtle but powerful filter. Bodies that align with shared expectations pass more easily through social space. Those that draw discomfort, suspicion, or unease encounter friction, not always exclusion, but hesitation, delay, reduced opportunity. Evolution listens closely to such patterns. The preference is rarely explicit. No one announces it. It emerges from countless small choices. Who is invited? Who is admired? Who is avoided? Over time, these micro-decisions accumulate into pressure as real as famine. Symmetry becomes attractive. Predictability becomes reassuring. Faces that fit familiar patterns are read as trustworthy. Bodies that move in expected ways are read as safe. Difference becomes noise. Anthropologists have noted how aesthetic norms converge rapidly once populations stabilize. Ideals of proportion, posture, and expression solidify and are reinforced through ritual, art, and narrative. The body becomes not just a biological entity, but a symbol of belonging. This does not eliminate variation entirely, but it narrows the range of what is rewarded. Bodies outside that range do not vanish, but they reproduce less often, less easily. Over long stretches of time, this matters. Unlike environmental selection, aesthetic selection favors sameness. It does not prepare for the unexpected. It reinforces what is already known. In this context, physical evolution slows not because pressure disappears, but because pressure demands conformity rather than innovation. Novel forms are not tested against nature, they are tested against expectation. This effect intensifies with cultural transmission. Stories, images, and ideals circulate widely, reinforcing a shared template of what a human should look like. The body learns to approximate the image. Even when environments change, aesthetic norms lag behind, anchoring bodies to outdated ideals. This creates tension. Bodies struggle to perform in new contexts while remaining visually acceptable in old ones. Over time, the human form becomes optimized not for survival, but for recognition. To look human in a way others expect. To fit the silhouette that culture has decided represents humanity itself. This may help explain why modern humans across vast geographies appear more alike than expected. not because genetics demand it, but because social reward does. In such a system, extreme adaptation becomes risky. A body too well suited to a particular environment may appear strange elsewhere. Generalist forms, aesthetically neutral, travel better socially. Evolution once again favors the median. This aesthetic filtering works quietly. It does not require enforcement. Desire does the work. Preference does the work. The body follows. Art history preserves this process in still form. Human figures become increasingly stylized, idealized, standardized. Proportions repeat. Faces soften. The range of representation narrows even as technical skill improves. These images feed back into reality. Bodies emulate what is depicted. What is depicted becomes what is desired. A loop closes. The body, sensing reward, settles into a narrow band of variation. Evolution does not resist. It aligns. This raises an unsettling possibility, that humanity did not stop changing because it reached biological equilibrium, but because it reached aesthetic consensus. A shared agreement on what a human should be, enforced not by law, but by attraction. If so, then the stillness of the human form is not natural at all. It is curated, and curation is selective. It removes outliers. It preserves the familiar. It values continuity over exploration. Yet this curation also blinds. It assumes that what looks right is what works best. History rarely supports this assumption. When environments shift beyond the range a curated body can tolerate, the cost becomes visible. Fragility emerges where resilience was needed. Uniformity fails where diversity might have helped. The body, shaped for recognition, struggles with reality. If aesthetic selection has narrowed human variation for millennia, then it has done so at the expense of adaptability. The comfort of sameness has replaced the insurance of difference. This does not mean change cannot return, but it suggests that change will not be welcomed when it does. It will look wrong, unfamiliar, unacceptable. Evolution may yet demand bodies that break aesthetic norms, that appear unsettling, that challenge what humanity believes itself to be. If that moment comes, the resistance will not be biological alone. It will be cultural, psychological, deeply emotional. The human form has been protected by preference for so long that it has become an icon rather than an experiment. Icons resist alteration. Whether the future will continue to reward sameness or whether survival will eventually outweigh recognition remains uncertain. For now, the body remains familiar, shaped as much by desire as by DNA, held in place by a shared image that whispers, quietly but persistently, this is what a human looks like. And evolution, listening as it always does, waits to see whether that whisper will continue to be obeyed. There comes a moment when the environment no longer feels natural at all, not hostile, not harsh, but manufactured, temperature adjusted, light scheduled, food engineered, risk minimized. The human body moves through spaces designed to anticipate it, cushion it, correct it before failure can occur. This is not adaptation in the old sense, it is preemption. Artificial environments remove unpredictability. They flatten extremes. Cold no longer selects, heat no longer selects, hunger no longer selects. Even injury often does not select. The body survives conditions it was never shaped to endure because the environment bends first. This creates a new evolutionary dynamic. Selection pressure does not disappear, it relocates. Instead of filtering bodies through nature, it filters them through compatibility with systems. Can the body interface with technology? Can it tolerate sedentary rhythms? Can it respond to abstract stress without visible threat? Those that can persist, those that cannot, are adjusted, medicated, supported. Failure becomes rare, prolonged, diffuse. Artificial selection begins to resemble natural selection only in outline. It preserves life without reshaping it. It favors maintenance over transformation. Over time, this produces a paradox. The more artificial the environment becomes, the less incentive there is for the body to change. The environment absorbs the cost of mismatch. Evolution is deferred again. At the same time, technology accelerates beyond biological time. Interfaces shrink. Information speeds up. Attention fragments. The body struggles to keep pace, but it is not allowed to fail decisively enough to force adaptation. This creates a widening gap. Technology evolves. Flesh stagnates. Some see this as liberation, the end of biological limitation, the promise that humanity can transcend the slow grind of evolution through design. But transcendence has consequences. It severs feedback loops that once kept biology honest. In natural systems, failure teaches quickly. In artificial ones, failure is postponed. Lessons are learned too late or not at all. The body adapts by becoming passive. Muscles weaken without use. Bones thin without load. Senses dull when mediated. These are not mutations. They are atrophies, reversible in theory but persistent in practice. Meanwhile, technology begins to select for traits unrelated to survival in any biological sense. Tolerance for constant stimulation, comfort with abstraction, ability to sit still for long periods while mentally traversing vast symbolic spaces. These are cognitive, not physical, traits. The body follows reluctantly, conserving energy, reducing unnecessary mass, prioritizing efficiency over strength. This is not evolution forward or backward, it is evolution sideways. Artificial selection also introduces intentionality. Humans begin to choose which traits to support, which to correct. Vision is fixed, hearing amplified, hormones regulated. The body is edited not genetically but functionally. Each intervention reduces pressure for inherited change. Why evolve sharper eyesight when lenses exist? Why evolve stronger bones when supports exist? The body learns to rely. This reliance compounds. Children are born into worlds where assistance is assumed. Baselines shift. What was once a limitation becomes acceptable, even normal. Evolution listens carefully. It hears no urgency. And yet, artificial environments are fragile. They require constant energy, coordination, maintenance. When they falter, the body is exposed suddenly without preparation. History offers glimpses of this vulnerability. Power outages, supply chain breaks, infrastructure failures, moments when the artificial briefly recedes. The body, untrained for raw conditions, struggles. But even then, the environment returns quickly enough to prevent lasting biological response. The interruption is too short, the lesson too brief. This cycle repeats, reinforcing the illusion that the body does not need to change. There is another layer to artificial selection that remains uncomfortable to name: control. Systems prefer predictability. Bodies that behave consistently are easier to manage. Environments are designed not only for comfort, but for regulation. Movement tracked, sleep scheduled, productivity measured. The body is nudged toward patterns that fit economic and technological systems. Deviations are corrected through design rather than discipline. Over generations, this shapes expectation. Bodies learn how to exist within constraints they did not choose. Evolution hears the pattern. Compliance is rewarded. Physical novelty becomes inconvenient. A body that requires different accommodations disrupts optimization. Artificial systems favor standardization even more aggressively than natural ones ever did. Thus, the human form is held in place by layers of design. Furniture shaped for average proportions, interfaces sized for typical hands, spaces built for predictable movement. The body adapts by staying within those bounds. Change becomes costly not because it is harmful, but because it is incompatible. If the human body has stopped changing, it may be because the world has decided what kind of body it wants to host. This leads to a final unease. Artificial environments evolve rapidly, driven by innovation rather than inheritance. They may drift away from the body faster than the body can follow, even with assistance. When that happens, the question of evolution returns with urgency. Will the body finally be forced to change, or will technology continue to compensate until the gap becomes unbridgeable? Some imagine a future where biology is abandoned entirely, replaced by augmentation, by integration with machines. In that vision, evolution does not resume, it is bypassed. But bypassing does not erase biology, it suspends it. The body remains, aging, vulnerable, conserved in a state it did not choose. Whether artificial selection represents the final arrest of human physical evolution or merely its longest delay remains unresolved. The environment hums quietly, perfectly tuned. The body fits for now. But artificial worlds, like all constructions, depend on continuity, and continuity has never been guaranteed. If the scaffolding ever falls away for good, the body will face the world alone again. And only then will it be clear whether evolution truly stopped, or whether it was simply waiting for nature to return. At a certain point, the pace of change becomes asymmetric. The world begins to move faster than the body can register, faster than it can negotiate through sensation and instinct. Decisions are made in milliseconds. Systems react before muscles can tense, before nerves can signal danger. The human body, evolved to survive through perception and response, finds itself surrounded by processes that no longer wait for it. This is not merely acceleration, it is decoupling. Technology no longer extends the body in simple ways. It replaces functions entirely. Memory outsourced, navigation automated, calculation instantaneous, even judgment increasingly mediated by systems that learn without sensation. The body remains present, but peripheral, an observer within a loop it did not design. In earlier eras, tools amplified effort. They still required bodily engagement. Now, many tools bypass it. A gesture triggers vast consequences. A decision made without movement reshapes entire environments. The body's role shrinks further, not because it fails, but because it is no longer needed at the scale where change occurs. Evolution depends on relevance. Traits that no longer influence outcomes drift toward neutrality. When survival and success hinge on abstract systems rather than physical performance, the body's variation matters less. This introduces a new kind of stillness, not the stillness of equilibrium, but of irrelevance. The nervous system adapts in subtle ways. Attention fragments. Reward systems recalibrate. Dopamine responds to symbols rather than stimuli. Stress arises without threat. Satisfaction arrives without effort. The body experiences consequences divorced from action. These conditions are unprecedented. Evolution has no template for them. The signals are noisy, contradictory, often misleading. The body responds as best it can, but without clear direction. In this space, a strange inversion begins to appear. The body, once the slow-changing element in a fast-changing world, becomes the slowest part of a system accelerating beyond it. Technology evolves through iteration measured in months. Biology responds in generations. The gap widens. Some propose that this gap will be closed through integration, augmentation, neural interfaces, genetic editing. The idea is not to wait for evolution, but to take control of it, to redesign the body deliberately rather than allowing it to drift. If this occurs, evolution does not resume. It is replaced. Selection no longer emerges from survival, but from preference. Design supersedes inheritance. But design carries assumptions. It optimizes for current goals, current environments, current values. Evolution, by contrast, prepares for the unknown. It preserves redundancy. It tolerates inefficiency in exchange for resilience. A designed body may perform exquisitely under expected conditions and fail catastrophically outside them. This raises a quiet tension. As technology accelerates, it narrows its focus. As the body remains broad, conservative, it retains capacities that no longer appear useful until suddenly they are. In moments of system failure, it is often the simplest, most embodied skills that matter. Endurance, improvisation, physical presence. Yet these skills are precisely the ones least rewarded by modern environments. The body is being trained out of relevance while still being relied upon as a last resort. This contradiction cannot persist indefinitely. Either the body will be reshaped to match the speed and abstraction of its tools, or tools will continue to evolve independently until the body becomes a liability rather than a participant. If the former occurs, physical evolution returns, but under guidance. Directed, uneven, intentional. A break from everything that came before. If the latter occurs, humanity splits functionally, if not biologically. Those integrated deeply into accelerating systems diverge in behavior, perception, and dependency from those who are not. The body remains the same, but the experience of inhabiting it fractures. Some already sense this fracture, a feeling of lag, of being slightly behind one's own life, of reacting after the moment has passed. The body, trained for immediacy, struggles in a world of anticipation. Evolution once thrived on lag. Delay between change and response created pressure. Now, delay is engineered out of systems. The body is left holding consequences without influence. This may explain the persistent sense of unease that accompanies technological progress. Not fear of machines, but a deeper intuition that something essential has been sidelined. The human form, unchanged for millennia, watches a future arrive that it did not help shape biologically, a future that may no longer need it in the way past futures always did. If evolution has been waiting for a pressure strong enough to override buffering, acceleration may provide it, not through scarcity or climate, but through obsolescence. What happens to a species whose body is no longer the primary medium of survival? One possibility is atrophy, gradual irrelevance, a slow fading of physical capacity as systems compensate more completely. Another is bifurcation. Different relationships to technology produce different selective environments, even within the same species. In that case, physical evolution may resume unevenly, not across humanity as a whole, but along lines of access, dependence, and design. The fossil record of the future, if it exists, may not show dramatic change at first. It may show subtle divergence, slight shifts in bone density, muscle attachment, cranial proportions altered by interface rather than environment. Or it may show nothing at all, because the body ceased to be the site where adaptation mattered. If that happens, the long pause in human physical evolution will not have been a mystery. It will have been a transition, a quiet handoff from flesh to construct. Whether this handoff is temporary or final remains unanswered. The body waits, as it has for thousands of years, familiar and unchanged, while the world accelerates past it. The question that lingers is not whether humans stopped changing physically. It is whether the next change will still be human at all. The long pause invites a final unease, one that cannot be settled by data or measurement. When a species appears unchanged for so long, the temptation is to call it finished, to assume the body has reached its final form. But evolution does not work toward conclusions. It moves through contingencies, and contingencies by their nature remain invisible until they arrive. The human form stands at such a threshold, familiar enough to feel permanent, fragile enough to feel provisional. It has endured ice, famine, collapse, ritual, abstraction, and acceleration without visibly reinventing itself. This endurance can be mistaken for mastery or for stagnation. Neither is fully convincing. What if the stillness is not an end state, but a holding pattern sustained by circumstances that no longer apply? A form conserved because the cost of change was consistently higher than the cost of waiting. Until now. Throughout history, evolution has favored bodies that respond to pressure, but pressure has been diluted, deflected, absorbed by systems layered thickly around flesh. Tools, institutions, technologies, beliefs. Each one has buffered the body from the need to transform. Yet buffering does not eliminate pressure. It delays it, and delay allows pressure to accumulate. At some point, the mismatch between body and world becomes too large to manage through compensation alone. When systems fail faster than they can be repaired, when environments shift beyond the range tools were designed to handle, when abstraction collapses back into immediacy. In such moments, evolution does not ask permission. It does not negotiate. It acts. The question is whether the human body, after so long without visible change, still retains the capacity to respond. Whether the machinery of transformation remains intact, or whether it has been weakened by disuse. Biology suggests that potential remains. Genetic variation still exists. Plasticity still operates. But potential is not destiny. It must be activated under conditions that persist long enough to matter. If future pressures arrive gradually, buffered unevenly, the pause may continue. Humanity may remain recognizable, compensating endlessly through external means. If pressures arrive abruptly and globally, without avenues for escape or mediation, the body may be forced to speak again, and it may do so in ways that feel unfamiliar, even unsettling. Physical evolution does not promise improvement. It promises fit. A future human form shaped by sustained scarcity, extreme heat, altered gravity, or long-term isolation would not resemble present ideals. It would not look like us in the way we expect. That possibility is often resisted. not because it is impossible, but because it threatens identity. To change physically is to admit that what we are now is not final. Perhaps this is the deepest reason the stillness feels so compelling. It reassures. It allows humanity to imagine itself as complete. But history offers no examples of species granted permanence. The long silence in the fossil record may not indicate that evolution stopped. It may indicate that it has been waiting for a condition that has not yet fully arrived. A condition where buffering fails everywhere at once. Whether that condition will emerge through climate, technology, resource collapse, or something not yet imagined remains unknown. Evolution does not announce its return in advance. If and when it does, it will not align with human plans. It will not respect aesthetic preference, institutional continuity, or technological ambition. It will reshape whatever remains capable of survival. In that sense, the question, why did humans stop changing physically, may itself be incomplete. Perhaps humans did not stop changing. Perhaps they postponed it, and postponement, extended long enough, creates the illusion of finality. The human body stands as evidence of that illusion, a form conserved through extraordinary circumstances, mistaken for an end point rather than a moment. Whether the next chapter belongs to biology again, or whether humanity has truly transferred its evolution elsewhere, cannot be known from the present. The bones remain silent. The world continues to shift, and somewhere between those two facts lies the answer. Waiting, not for belief, but for pressure strong enough to make itself undeniable.